The arena hummed with anticipation, a restless energy rippling through the crowd as thousands of voices merged into a single deafening roar. This wasn't just another fight. This was the fight. Two warriors, each carrying the weight of expectation, reputation, and raw, unfiltered power, were about to collide. Khamzat Chimaev, the relentless grappler with an insatiable hunger for dominance, versus Alex Pereira, the cold, calculating striker with knockout power that had sent legends crumbling to the canvas. Styles clashed, stakes soared, and the entire combat sports world stood on edge, waiting to witness the storm unfold. Khamzat had torn through opponents like a force of nature, dragging them into deep waters before drowning them in sheer pressure. There was no hesitation in his approach, only an unbreakable will to dictate every second of the fight. His wrestling was suffocating, his aggression unmatched, and every time he stepped into the cage, the question wasn't whether he would win, but how quickly he would break the man standing across from him. But tonight was different. Across from him stood Pereira, a man who had spent years refining his craft, honing his striking into something lethal, something surgical. The Brazilian's fists didn't just land, they detonated. One mistake, one opening, and it was lights out. As the lights dimmed and the walkouts began, the energy in the building shifted. Khamzat stormed forward, eyes locked, body loose, but coiled like a predator in its prime. There was no smile, no sign of nerves, only an eerie calm that spoke louder than words. Pereira, in contrast, moved with the quiet confidence of a seasoned warrior. His steps were deliberate, his expression unreadable, as if he had already seen the fight play out in his mind 100 times. The contrast was stark, fire against ice, chaos against precision. Both fighters stepped into the cage, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The referee's instructions were nothing more than a formality. Neither man blinked, neither acknowledged a word. There was only the fight. And then the bell rang. Khamzat exploded forward like a missile, cutting the distance in an instant, his arms reaching for the clinch before Pereira could set his feet. The striker backpedaled, throwing a stiff jab to disrupt the advance, but Chimaev was already underneath it, already driving forward. The crowd erupted as bodies collided against the fence, the sound of struggle filling the air. Pereira dug his underhooks, planting his feet, trying to stay upright, but Khamzat's pressure was relentless. The cage rattled under the force, and for a split second, it seemed inevitable Pereira was going down. But then, something changed. A shift in weight, a perfectly timed maneuver, and suddenly, Pereira wasn't just defending, he was striking. A knee snapped up from nowhere, just grazing Khamzat's chin. It wasn't a clean shot, but it was enough to make him hesitate, to force him to rethink his entry. The moment was brief, but in fights like these, a fraction of a second could mean everything. Khamzat adjusted, reset, and went right back to work, bulldozing forward with even greater urgency. Pereira circled, his back nearly brushing the fence, knowing he couldn't afford to be trapped. Another feint, another level change from Khamzat, and then Pereira unleashed. A right hand, fast and brutal, whizzed through the air, barely missing as Chimaev weaved to the side. The margin was razor thin. The crowd was on its feet, the tension unbearable. Every movement, every twitch of muscle felt like it could be the beginning of the end. And then, as Khamzat lunged again, determined to impose his will, Pereira planted his feet and let something monstrous fly. The moment Khamzat lunged, Pereira's counter came like a thunderclap. A left hook, coiled with precision and violence, snapped through the air, aimed for Chimaev's jaw. The crowd gasped, expecting impact, expecting the kind of knockout that had defined Pereira's career. But Khamzat wasn't there. At the last possible moment, he twisted his body, slipping just outside the arc of destruction, his instinct sharper than the blink of an eye. Before Pereira could reset, Khamzat seized the opening. His arms wrapped around Pereira's waist in an instant, and then, with a surge of power, he lifted the former kickboxing champion clean off his feet. The entire arena seemed to shake as Pereira crashed onto the canvas, his back slamming hard against the mat. Khamzat wasted no time. He advanced like a storm, pressing his weight down, his hands working fast, pinning, controlling, suffocating. Pereira gritted his teeth, his muscles straining against the oppressive force. But this was Chimaev's domain, and every second on the ground was a second closer to disaster. But Pereira wasn't just another name on a highlight reel. With a sudden explosion of movement, he bridged hard, using his long limbs to shift Khamzat just enough to turn onto his side. The moment was tiny, almost imperceptible, but it was all he needed. A sharp elbow lashed out, catching Khamzat's temple. Another followed, then another. The audience roared as Pereira, against all odds, started to shift the momentum. Chimaev growled in frustration, his grip loosening for just a heartbeat. And that was when Pereira struck. He twisted his hips, swinging one of his legs free, and in an instant, the two men were scrambling. Pereira shoved against Khamzat's chest, forcing separation, and before anyone could process what had happened, both fighters were back on their feet. The moment Pereira found space, his demeanor changed. His breath was heavy, his body marked with the struggle, but his eyes burned with something dangerous. Khamzat charged forward again, determined to close the distance, but this time Pereira was waiting. His stance was different now, more calculated, more measured. A flicker of a feint, just enough to make Khamzat react, and then the right knee came from nowhere. Fast, devastating, perfectly timed. It wasn't a clean hit, but it was enough to make Khamzat stagger, his balance faltering for the first time in the fight. A hush fell over the arena for half a second before a wave of cheers erupted, fans realizing that Pereira had just found his opening. The Predator had tasted blood. But just when it seemed like the tide was turning, something unexpected happened. Something that no one, not even Pereira, saw coming. Pereira's knee had found its mark, but the fight was far from over. Khamzat's body wavered for only a fraction of a second before instinct kicked in. His eyes burned with defiance as he powered through the momentary stumble, surging forward like a man who had never even considered the possibility of retreat. He wasn't just fighting to win. He was fighting to dominate, to silence any doubt that his will could be broken. Pereira knew he couldn't let the moment slip. He pressed forward, hands coiled into fists, his strikes now carrying a new urgency. A left jab flicked out, testing the waters, followed by a sharp right cross aimed straight at Chimaev's chin. But Khamzat wasn't there. He slipped under the punch, his reflexes razor-sharp despite the damage he had taken. In a blink, he changed levels and drove forward, arms locking around Pereira's legs with unstoppable force. The crowd erupted as Pereira was lifted off his feet once more. He twisted midair, desperately trying to shift his weight, but Khamzat had already made his decision. Instead of slamming him down as expected, he adjusted in a split second, sweeping Pereira's legs mid-flight and sending him crashing awkwardly to the mat. The Brazilian landed hard, his head bouncing slightly off the canvas, and before he could recover, Khamzat was on him. With relentless pressure, Chimaev drove his forearm across Pereira's neck, pinning him to the ground while his free hand rained down strikes. Pereira struggled, his body arching under the weight, but Khamzat's grip was vice-like. The referee hovered nearby, watching closely, ready to step in if the assault became too much. But Pereira refused to break. He shifted, planting his feet, bridging his hips in a last-ditch effort to escape. Then, something completely unexpected happened. Instead of trying to regain his feet, Pereira wrapped his long arms around Khamzat's head, locking in a tight guillotine choke from the bottom. Gasps shot through the arena. It was a desperate move, but one that had ended fights before. His biceps flexed, squeezing with every ounce of strength he had left. For the first time in the fight, Khamzat was caught. His hands shot up, fighting against the choke, his body tensed as he worked to break free. The crowd was on its feet. Khamzat twisted, trying to alleviate the pressure, his face contorting as the seconds ticked by. But just when it seemed like Pereira might pull off the unthinkable, Chimaev adjusted. He shifted his weight forward, pushing into Pereira's grip, and with a burst of energy, he popped his head free. The moment his airway cleared, he went straight back to work. With Pereira still on his back, Khamzat climbed higher, trapping one arm while his legs hooked into position. The transition was seamless, and suddenly, the entire arena realized what was about to happen. Before Pereira could react, Khamzat locked his arms under the chin and squeezed. The rear naked choke was in deep. Pereira bucked, twisted, his fingers clawing at Khamzat's arms, but it was too late. The pressure was immense, cutting off his airflow, sapping the last of his strength. His movements slowed, his limbs weakening as the inevitable became clear. And then, he tapped. The arena exploded with noise. Khamzat rolled off, his chest rising and falling with deep, victorious breaths, while Pereira lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, processing what had just happened. The war had been brutal, unpredictable, and pushed both men to their limits. But in the end, Khamzat Chimaev had found a way. As he climbed to his feet, his hands raised high, the moment was undeniable. The doubters had been silenced. The challenge had been met. And as the referee lifted his arm, declaring him the victor, the only thing louder than the roar of the crowd was the unshakable certainty that both of these warriors had just etched their names into history.